Welcome to the Smith House and to the Alan K. Smith reading series. My name is Ethan Rutherford. I teach creative writing here at Trinity. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Sloane Crosley to campus to read from her work. Please take a minute to silence your cell phones if you haven't done it already. Although that is my favorite part of the reading, when Uptown Funk sort of blasts over. Sloane Crosley is the author of the New York Times best-selling essay collections I Was Told There'd Be Cake, which was a finalist for the Thurber Prize for American Humor, and How Did You Get This Number? She has served as an editor of the Best American Travel Writing series, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Believer, The Guardian, Elle, and GQ. Her new novel, The Clasp, is a comedy of manners about three estranged friends in one famous, very famous short story, The Necklace, by Guy de Maupassant. I practiced that all afternoon. And if for some reason that doesn't grab you, here's another hook from the wonderful writer Gary Scheingart. The Clasp reads like The Goonies written by Laurie Moore, a touching but never sentimental portrait of a trio of quasi-adults turning into adults. This is one of those rare, deep literary books that also features a plot. From the shores of Florida to the coast of Normandy, wonderful, unforgettable things happen in this enormously hilarious novel, and they are written in a language so beautiful, I gnashed my teeth at Sloane Crosley's talent. I've known Sloane for a number of years now. We worked together at Vintage Books, and we were basically babies. She was a good publicist. I was not a good publicist. But like all, or a lot, or most people who work in publishing, we found our way to those jobs because we like books, because we like being around authors, and we thought that maybe someday if things broke our way, we'd have books of our own. And here's where our paths diverge a little bit. After a few years, I left New York to write short stories about people freezing to death on ice floes. And she wrote a series of wonderful, insightful, and funny personal essays that, when collected and published, shot up the New York Times bestseller list. I read everything she wrote with deep admiration and pure pleasure. These essays are marvels of economy and tone and intonation. And then one day I got a phone call and she said she'd written a novel. I said, "Oh my God, please send it." She said, "I don't know." I said, "I'm already at Kinko's. I'm bored out of my mind. Send it now." And she did. So there's something funny that happens when a good friend sends you a book. Your first thought is, what if it's bad? What am I going to say? Will we still be friends, even if I don't like it? And your second thought is a little darker, and it's this. What if it's amazing? I'm going to feel bad about myself. She sent it, I read it, and I'll spare you some suspense. It was amazing, which honestly was no surprise. But it was so good, and I became so immersed in this book that those selfish writerly thoughts, which is what is this book telling me about me, it didn't even enter the room. Even from page one, I was lost in this novel, and I was with these characters, I was laughing, and I didn't want it to end. When a friend makes something beautiful like this, it can feel like a miracle. You go, how did you do this? But of course, miracles have very little to do with it, and it's hard work. The Clasp was a national bestseller, a New York Times editor's pick, and will soon be a movie for those of you who like the silver screen. And Sloane has been called one of the funniest and sharpest writers around. It's our great pleasure to have her here to read tonight. So please join me in welcoming Sloane Crosley.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you, Ethan. That was really lovely. I felt the same way when I read your first short stories, where I think the highest compliment you can give a friend who's a writer is it's judging by how quickly you forget that they wrote it. And I think it was around sentence 3. I'm like, I'm in. I forgot until the end. I had to give you any feedback. It was amazing. So thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here. I realized that the last time I was at Trinity when we were driving up was probably to play tennis because I went to school very close by. I went to Connecticut College, which is just sort of a different version, I think, of Trinity. I remember I had a friend who transferred, or a couple of friends who transferred here, which was so funny. It just reminded me of like changing your name from Goldenberg to Goldberg or something like that when you come to this country, because then no one will know. It's very, very similar. But you guys do have the gift that once you graduate, I guess if there's any confusion whatsoever, it'll be between you and Trinity College in Dublin. Whereas I get asked questions about my great basketball team for my entire life. But anyway, so as Ethan said, this is my first novel, and so I'm going to read to you a little bit from it, and then we can have a conversation. Basically, it's the story, just to give you a rough background. I'm going to start reading from the beginning, so there's not too much lead up needed for that. Otherwise, I'd be in trouble about the book in general when you start reading from page 1. But it's essentially the story of 3 friends, and it's told from 3 different perspectives, 2 men and 1 woman. And I'm going to read you from, just coincidentally, from the 2 different guys today. And they sort of reunite about 10 years after college, and they, sort of been speaking, sort of not been speaking, have drifted apart. They've gone to a college that's not terribly unlike this one. But they reunited at a lavish wedding of a friend in Miami. And then basically one of them, through a series of events I won't spoil for you, becomes obsessed with the idea that the necklace from Guy de Maupassant's famous short story, The Necklace, if you know it, and we can talk about it afterwards as well. One of them decides that it's real, even though the point of that short story is that it's fake. But it's sort of madcap. And they sort of go on this trip to France together to find it, which is probably where Gary's very kind Goonies reference comes in. But for now, I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the wedding and Victor's viewpoint, who is sort of the Eeyore-like, Job-like, sad sack of the group. I was just sort of fascinated by this guy that I found in many friend groups where he's not left out, but he is sort of the punching bag. So he's invited, but for what purpose? But we love him. And then the next passage I'll read is rather short, and that is Nathaniel, who's sort of the not as lovable jerk. And those are fun to write. But anyway, okay. We shall begin. At first, they watched the rain from inside the tent, and then they watched it come inside the tent. A stone path extended from the house to the shore. When the shuttle buses arrived, the stones were opaque, but now they were translucent, the kind of wet that made it difficult to imagine them ever being dry again. Lightning struck the surface of the ocean, and a curtain of hot wind swayed inward at their feet, pushing detached bouquet petals in a row. Victor took a step back. These were his only nice shoes. Victor had never been on a private island before, which was not shocking. But he had also never been to Florida before, which was a little shocking. True, he was a poorly traveled person, but still, Disney World, spring break, other people's grandparents. Florida had simply slipped through the cracks of his adulthood, like some idiom heard too late. He was under the impression that the rain here was supposed to be extreme but brief. The opposite of, say, Seattle, a place he hadn't been to either. But this was a monsoon. The groomsmen's jackets had come off, and the women had grown shorter over the course of the evening. Everyone was buzzed. What time was it, 10 p.m.? Too early to be drunk in real life, but right on schedule for Carolyn Markson's wedding. He heard her cackle in the distance and turned back to face the ocean, letting his mind drift. He was dubious of his environs. Florida, rather the stretch of it he had witnessed from the airport, causeways and condominiums, sunrise liquor and sunset dental, bank branches surrounded by menacing palmetto plants, was trying to trick him into thinking it was a real place. A place where people rode school buses and purchased paper towel in bulk. His table mates took one look at Victor's chowder-fed skin and launched into stories of art and literary fairs, of this country club or that being very, quote, old Florida. But Victor knew from old. He grew up in Massachusetts, home to America's oldest ballpark, strictest landmark laws, and most famous horseback ride. Florida was pretty colonized come lately by comparison. Even the old people here felt new. Victor's parents were in their 60s, but their actual 60s, not their fake 40s. His mother, a substitute teacher, would no longer do stairs and was increasingly vigilant about her Raynouds. His father, a land surveyor, had given him a $100 bill and a bottle of You Bet chocolate syrup when he moved to Park Slope with Nathaniel after graduation. This was before Nathaniel fled to Los Angeles, swapping his literary aspirations for centered dialogue. Now Victor lived alone in an alcove studio in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. I think you stole my balls. Victor had returned to his seat to assess the damage to his shoes and found a thick-necked man gripping to a dinner roll as if he had freshly yanked it from the chest cavity of a buffalo. The man pointed at a dish of butterballs. "Oh," said Victor, "I did. Sorry, I went left. You can have mine." The man sniffed. "I think this one has rosemary and this one is Himalayan sea salt." "Sounds good," said Victor. "I despise rosemary." Carolyn had arranged the rest of their collegiate circle around a table clear across the dance floor. Victor was momentarily buoyed by the idea that this was an act of faith, suggesting that he was harmless, nay, charming, when foisted upon strangers. Unfortunately, these thoughts were immediately anchored by knowing that it was an act of acquiescence. Carolyn felt obliged to invite him. He couldn't be the only one she left out. Out of some kind of misplaced retaliation, Victor hadn't touched his main course. This put him in a standoff with the catering staff who, out of their own misplaced retaliation, had yet to remove his plate. From this vantage point, Victor could see Nathaniel whispering in Kezia's ear. Nathaniel's jawline had become strangely defined these past few years. It made Victor touch his own jaw to see if jaws were that much of a separate entity on everyone. These days, Nathaniel was also dressing better. Foppish, that was the word, wasn't it? Fucktard, that was the other one. His friend had become both of these things. They barely spoke anymore, forcing Victor to make a choice. Be a needy girl about it, or ignore it. He chose the latter, but right this second, there was something blocking his path of disregard. Kezia's mouth was so close to Nathaniel's that if she turned, their lips would touch. Her head was bent, chin tucked, listening raptly. She flipped a fork against the tablecloth, as if concentrating on the fork were the only thing keeping her from falling off the chair. "No tux for you?" The thick-necked man chewed with his mouth open. "I couldn't afford it." "Well," the man said, "every self-respecting young man should have a tux." "Well," Victor lifted his glass, "that explains why I don't have one." "And where did you say you lived in New York?" "Brooklyn." "Brooklyn Heights is nice," said the man. "That it is." "And how did you make the acquaintance of the bride?" "We went to college together," said Victor, "the group of us." He gestured around the tent, even though he wasn't sure where anyone was. Kezia and Nathaniel had gotten up. The fork stayed behind. "Ah," said the man, "so you've known each other since you were babies." A sharp memory. The night freshman year when Victor managed to bring Carolyn Markson back to his dorm. When Victor reached between her legs, she hopped off the bed, bent down like a baboon, and showed him her tampon string. Proof for prudeness. Still, he wished his roommates had been conscious. Victor didn't bring many girls home. He was not an attractive guy, he got that. He was wiry and he hunched. His face was horsey but not equine, olive but not Mediterranean. Though on 2 separate occasions he had been told that he bore a resemblance to the sharp-faced actor Adrian Brody. He was beginning to doubt there would be a 3rd occasion. "And you and Carolyn went to a co-ed school?" Yes, said Victor. "We did. Ginny, my wife, went to one of those glorified lesbian communes. Some all-girls place that should have gone co-ed but didn't. Practically bankrupt now. Always some third-rate yoga instructor on the cover of the alumni magazine." Victor listened as best he could. He was usually okay with being a receptacle for such gripes. It was all feeding a beast that never went hungry, a beast of casual disdain for the wealthy, a socialist tapeworm in his gut that snacked on morsels of humidor and meditation retreat. But enough was enough. "Excuse me." Victor put his napkin on his chair. "I'm going to go watch the storm." "You can't see it from here?" "I need new ones of these." Victor pushed his glasses up the Sisyphean slope of his nose. The man tightened a cufflink, putting a sprightly spotlight on the wine glasses. Ginny materialized behind them, all smiles and cleavage and light-hearted scolding for, quote, holding this young man captive. "Nice to meet you," she said, even though they had not. As Victor squished his way towards the edge of the tent, he spotted Olivia Arellano, standing beneath a flickering lantern. God, Olivia Arellano. He thought he had glimpsed the back of her head during the ceremony. Pickled in rum and venom, Olivia looked the same every time he had seen her over the past decade, always wearing the same Olivia uniform. As Kezia once astutely pointed out, you know that girl owns 20 black sweaters as opposed to one frequently recycled black sweater. The last time Victor had even seen Olivia's name was a year ago, when Paul Stephenson and Gray Kelly, keepers of the collegiate ideal, newlyweds, chief bangers of the networking drum, had organized a gathering because it had, quote, been too long. "Gang," began the email from Paul. "It's been way too long." Who's to say, thought Victor, who decides? What heterosexual man uses so many vowels? The email was also signed from Gray as if she had typed her own name, like they were children taking turns on an outgoing voicemail. Victor skipped drinks. How a girl like Olivia Arellano had heard of a tiny liberal arts school in New England, never mind applied to it, never mind heard of New England, confounded him to this day. He and Olivia had never been close, and they never would be. Yet even she was tied to him. Olivia Arellano was the first person he met. She struck up a conversation with him while they waited at campus security for their respective room keys. Fresh off the plane from Caracas, she carried a peeling leather trunk that looked as if it contained human bones, and asked him questions like, "Do you think the next 4 years will be stimulating, or do you think we will liken them to jail?" He had no idea what she was talking about, but her boobs were up to her neck. Olivia was a false advertisement for what college women would be like, a false advertisement for herself even. She was studying him, peppering him with questions not to befriend him, but to determine if he was like her, sophisticado. He was not. He had just come from a house with aluminum siding in Sudbury, Massachusetts. He didn't have a passport. His jackets were North Face, his storage bins Bed Bath & Beyond, his mother a Law & Order SVU fan. They accepted their respective keys and headed for separate ends of campus. He watched her glide up the gentle slope of a path, one of the many that would become as familiar as the veins in the back of his hand. Even now, a decade later, he could remember that freshman-specific sensation, like he'd know this girl for the rest of his life, and like he'd never see her again. Turns out both hunches were right. That conversation was the longest he would have with Olivia for a solid year. He saw her, of course. Everyone saw everyone. But Olivia did her dating off campus, shunning any man who could be accessed via a 4-digit extension. She elected alternative housing, slept with professors, refused to eat in the dining hall, all before losing the revolt and settling down junior year. Half of their class went abroad, but Olivia stayed because she was abroad already. She melded herself into Victor's circle of friends like a blob of mercury, absorbed by the girls, lady advocates who saw some invisible wound in need of tending when they looked at her. Or maybe they just saw another pretty face to squeeze into their photos. He didn't really care about their motivations, not really. Olivia Arellano was never the primary object of his affections. That title belonged to someone else. And by their final semester, none of it mattered. By then, Victor was allowing himself to fantasize about Kezia's face only in profile, never indulging in the dead-on view. By then, he was supposed to have forgiven her for cruelly rejecting his love. Not just forgiven, erased. To forgive was to be in conversation with the past, and well, they couldn't have that, now could they? Caps and gowns had been ordered, resumes sent out, mailbox keys returned. It was in poor taste to acknowledge that college had been anything other than a coming-of-age paradise. By then, they all had one foot out the door, and Victor had gotten himself a passport with a lone Canadian stamp in the middle. Dead grandfather in Toronto. That's the beginning. So that is sad, sad Victor. And now I'm going to read you from the perspective of Nathaniel, who has a slightly different outlook on things, though perhaps equally analytical, but mostly in his favor. And he lives in Los Angeles. The morning haze had yet to burn off. It was the hour at which Los Angeles feels most like San Francisco. Nathaniel went for a run around the reservoir, kicking up sand and watching women in the dog park. He ran back up the hill, too, the whole way. A month ago, after extolling the health benefits of a life in LA, after years of extolling the health benefits of a life in LA, something inside his body had turned on him. He felt fatigued no matter how much he slept or how much hot yoga he did. Sometimes he experienced shortness of breath just walking across a studio lot. He was about to turn 30, not 50. So he went to a nutritionist in Inglewood who told him to incorporate more zinc into his diet and drink more water. Then he went to an energy healer who told him more or less the same thing, but tacked on some meditative breathing exercises. Then he went to a kinesiologist who suggested that he keep both of his legs elevated above his heart whenever possible, especially when in the shower. Even when in the shower? No, said the kinesiologist, especially. It all worked for a while, but then one day he was sitting at home, legs up, trying to work, and his vision blurred. The page of dialogue he had just written transformed into impenetrable chunks of black squiggle. His heart started racing like a hummingbird's. That's what he told the cardiologist, who told him that if that were true, he'd be dead. Super dead, the cardiologist clarified. 1,200 beats per minute. Then the man told him that a whale beat would also be cause for concern at 6 beats per minute, and that giraffes have a second heart in their necks. Apparently, he was leaning toward veterinary medicine before switching to humans. The cardiologist conducted the usual tests for abnormalities. It wasn't a palpitation, it wasn't an arrhythmia, it wasn't a panic attack either. Well, Nathaniel could have told him that. He didn't have an office job or a mortgage or kids or girlfriend to panic about, just the steady pressure of being one of Los Angeles's 2 million aspiring TV writers, as many as a whole day's worth of hummingbird heartbeats. No, Nathaniel's heart appeared to be a dutiful muscle, opening and shutting its valves firmly. So what was it then? At long last, a second electrocardiogram came back, bearing the gift of a diagnosis. Nathaniel had an abnormally small heart. For a guy in the prime of his life, you have an abnormally small heart, said the cardiologist. It's not serious, you're not going to keel over, but it could explain the sudden uneven heart rate and the lightheadedness. Do you smoke? Nathaniel shook his head. Do you exercise? He thought it was pretty clear that he did. He was a naturally slim person, but a belly would appear on his abdomen if he did nothing to deter it. He had been very successful in keeping it at bay. Still, the doctor told him that he needed to get his heart rate up more often. That's why athletes have huge hearts, he said, removing his stethoscope. Nathaniel considered this. He considered the drug and sex scandals that plague professional athletes. He started to say it, sitting there in his underwear. They're not known for their huge hearts. But then he thought better of it. This doctor had chosen the most symbolic specialty in all the medical profession. He'd probably had it with otherwise intelligent people conflating medicine and symbolism. Nathaniel was no different. He knew that if he had received the opposite diagnosis, that of a swelled heart just bursting out of his chest, he would have told anyone who would listen. He would have used it to gain access to the sympathies and beds of women especially. Not that he needed the assistance, but man, what a deal sealer. He would have used it to win back the attention, if not the affection, of Bean, a painfully attractive but mediocre actress who had blown him off months ago. Bean was so hot, in one night he went down on her 4 times and cooed at photos of her new pet bunny in between. He ran faster up the hill. No matter how fast Nathaniel ran, his diagnosis felt more like a verdict. He couldn't escape the symbolism. He had not loved a member of the opposite sex in approximately ever. And maybe he never would. And it wasn't just humans for which he lacked passion. His love for a life of writing and literature, once fueled by an intense gut-level admiration for stories and novels, was now fueled by the external forces of fame and wealth. He confused competition with love, and because everyone else in Los Angeles was equally as confused, he felt, for the most part, totally sane. Now he was going to doctors because his heart knew what his mind didn't. He stood next to the refrigerator, refilling his water from the door and panting while his housemate, Percy, went back and forth from the kitchen with a plate of eggs. Nathaniel stood there, sweating, watching Percy add more hot sauce with each trip. Or you could take the bottle with you. When do you leave again? Asked Percy. Tomorrow, Nathaniel put his glass down. And whose wedding is this? You don't know her, he said. Girl from college. Kezia? No, random chick. You don't know her. Nonsense, said Percy. I know everyone, old man. Percy went back to watching a movie in the living room, some screener that displayed its screener status every 5 minutes. Old man. Nathaniel realized that, in addition to the heavy panting, he had been touching his lower back, and so he stopped. Thanks. I've been like hitting this microphone left and right. Hopefully it wasn't too feedbacky. So we're missing a third leg of the tripod here, which is the one who's probably closest to me, actually, Kezia, because she's the lady who works for a jewelry designer in New York, and jewelry ends up being folded very much into the book, and you can kind of tell the hints of Guy de Maupassant and things like that a little bit in these early chapters, where you have Nathaniel sort of lamenting his life in short stories, that he's traded it in for writing, a show that later turns out to be called Dude Move 2. He wanted to call it Dick Move, and no one at the network would let him, so it is called Dude Move. Anyway, but with that, I thought we could chat about it. So I will stand here as long as necessary. I feel very at home here until someone asks me a question. Or you're not gonna bid. I'm not gonna buy a house by accident. Hi.
Hey. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh,
I
thank you.
actually studied your work in college. I work here now. But
Oh.
Yeah. So it was really cool to see your name on the calendar today.
Oh, thanks.
What made you, so I read, I was told there'd be cake, and what made you want to write a novel as opposed to sort of the creative nonfiction that you've been writing?
Everyone heard that, right? Okay. She asked me what my favorite color was. No.
Yeah.
Well, I'd always wanted to. Oh, thank you. Hi. Thanks. Sorry, I'm also sick. So I'd actually always wanted to write a novel. So weirdly, even though it looks like it from the outside, that I switched from narrative nonfiction to fiction. I had written a really bad novel when I was actually, it started as my senior thesis at college, which is, I don't recommend for anyone who's a writer, don't do the following, which is don't write a novella, hand it in, and then decide it needs to be a novel, and just try to make it bigger by sort of, inflating its lips. It's a terrible idea because it sucks all the fun out of it. So that's what I did right away, and then I sort of fell backwards into nonfiction. But I'd always sort of written fiction. I always wanted to go back to it. It's just that it wasn't public. And then the other thing is that sometimes it helps to just have a different muscle, to look at something differently. That's why they say if you ever own a piece of art, you should move it around a lot, because then you stop seeing it after a while. And similarly, I think now, going back now as I am to the next book, which will be essays, I look at them differently now that I've done this. So it's sort of happened in reverse. It's a long answer to your question. Hi.
Hi. So I have a question about creating characters. So how do you figure out who your characters are when you start writing?
That's a very good question. And I'm filibustering by repeating it like a politician. So your question is, I think I always had Victor And in some ways, I think honestly a fault of the book is that in some ways it never gets away from him because he starts it off. And then I thought Kezia came pretty quickly afterwards. Her name, by the way, comes from a Catherine Mansfield short story. There's all sorts of little short story things that are in here. It's a funky name. But they were both sort of obsessed with Nathaniel in their own way. Victor because he was jealous, Kezia because she was trying not to be in love with him. And I thought, well, let's have him speak. And he turned out to be a blast to write. It's really funny to write, fun to write people like him. And also gives you, I thought it would give me more sympathy for sort of like this womanizing jerk. And there was like a shred of it that came around page like 300, but not really. But yeah, they just sort of, so it's not one of these things, there's this irritating thing, or I find it irritating that authors do when they start talking about their characters speaking for them, which would be lovely. And they also, you know, if they could pay my rent and make me waffles, like these would be great things. But I just wanted, I think once I had this sort of kernel of Victor, I realized that it's hard enough to write, you know, someone who's a man and get into that experience, or not terribly hard, but slightly different. But then the next challenge was to write, can I do two very different ones? And so then, in a way, it became sort of a challenge to me once I had the kernel of inspiration that caused these people to exist, if that makes sense. Yeah. I can tell you guys weird stories. Hey.
Professor always steps in when there's the awkward time.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about Maupassant? I mean, not everybody here necessarily knows the necklace, but one of the things that's always intrigued me about that story, and I haven't read the Clasp, so I don't know what you're doing with it, but I'd be curious to know what your take is. Most of the criticism of the necklace, most of the ways that sort of teach you how to teach the necklace, function along the lines of the deep irony of this woman having slaved away all her life to repay, you know, for this necklace that turned out to be paste, and what a sad, terrible fate she's had. And of course, I had never read it that way at all. I thought that she became a much more likable person and a much better person because of the life that she led, as opposed to this shallow, horrible life that she had wanted to lead. And there are some responses to Maupassant along those lines, but many fewer. Most of the responses are on the other side. So I'm curious to know what your response to Maupassant
I love this question.
and how that response feeds into what you're doing.
Okay,
Can you
thank
tell the
you.
story, like-
Yeah, I was about
you
to
just tell
say,
me.
yeah, I was like,
So, yeah, you go ahead.
I love the story. I love the question for two reasons. One is it gives me an opportunity to do something that I neglected to do before, which is explain the story. And I can also answer your question, which I'm excited about. Okay, so the short story, The Necklace, if you guys, how many, is there, like, can we do like a show of hands? Who's read it? It's okay. Okay, this is good, then we're doing this. Okay, it's super famous, and part of the reason it's famous is because it's so clean and quick, so it actually won't take me that long to summarize for you. Basically, it's a woman who's on the cusp of being part of society in late 19th century France, and her husband procures her an invitation to this fancy party, and you would think, given everything I've just told you, or what limited I have, that she'd be excited. Instead, she's really annoyed, she's pissed, she starts crying. She's like, what basically says, what the hell am I supposed to wear to this? I don't have any nice clothes, I don't have anything. They have a dress, but in that time period, wearing jewelry was incredibly important. And the husband comes up with the brilliant idea that she should borrow a piece of jewelry from her wealthiest friend. She's like, you're a genius, goes, borrows the necklace. And when she's there, she's also like, what's the nicest thing you have? Like, not just, you know, can I borrow these earrings, but like, I want, you know, the crown jewels. She's wearing this necklace, has the night of her life, goes home, does one of these, and realizes that it's fallen off. And it's somewhere, you know, somewhere in Paris. The two of them comb the banks of the Seine, they can't find anything. And so what they do is they beg, borrow, and steal, take out loans, and buy a replacement necklace the next day. And return that. But then meanwhile, these people who are on the cusp of being something are now in huge debt. Have to, you know, she has to take two jobs. She has a job as a maid. It's terrible. And at the very end of the story, it's about, I don't know, 10, 20 years later, and we have the sort of schlubby woman, our heroine, who's in the park, and she sees the rich woman. And the rich woman doesn't even recognize her because she looks so awful. And it's true. And she says, but with some pride, which is, I think, to your point, no small amount of pride, she's like, well, actually, this is what happened. And, we fooled you. I mean, in a good way. We tricked you. You never knew that we had lost the necklace. Isn't that great? And the woman takes her hand and says, oh, my dear, it was fake. I know. It's so sad. And
I don't think it's sad.
Well, see, the thing is, but it was perceived in France at the time definitely as being sad, and the French also were like, oh, it's just too sad, which is sort of ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine a book being criticized on the cover of the New York Times Book Review? They're like, yeah, it's a masterpiece, but it's a kind of a bummer. Like, no one, it's just not a measure by which we judge literature anymore. So that's the story, and to also just bring it back to the novel very quickly, what happened is in addition to exploring this time period in life of these 30-year-olds who aren't sure if they're going to be friends anymore, this college relationship, I also am a short story fanatic. I love them. And so I wanted to write a novel that was in some ways a kind of tribute to the short story, but I wasn't going to follow that plot line that I just gave you, because I think it's meant to be short. It would crush it. So each of these characters sort of go after something that may be real or may be fake, and they all follow the rough plot line of the necklace. And they eventually converge actually on Guy de Maupassant's estate in France. But meanwhile, to answer your question, I actually always think, and one of the characters also thinks, it's Nathaniel, of course, who thinks that really feels bad for the husband in all this. Because she's sort of a brat. I mean, he's like, oh, I got you this invitation. And she's like, what am I supposed to do with this? And, it's supposed to be like this tragedy of this woman, but I always read it as actually feeling quite bad for him, who's tried to please her, and he has to go into debt. Who do you think is working off all those jobs? And also, she was the one, there's a line in it where when she's at her friend's house, it's a very short story, when she's at her friend's home, and she says, her friend says, do you have anything, take what you like. And she goes through her friend's entire jewelry box, and then she goes, do you have anything else? I'm like, I mean, really, beggars can't be choosers. And so the part where she becomes a better person,
yeah.
I can see what you're seeing, but I think I see that only at the very end when she has this sort of, she's grown accustomed years later to her life. She's no longer a child. She puts away childish things, all the sort of like fancy, weird things she was concerned about. Like, oh, I can't wear flowers, I need jewelry. And now she's concerned about just feeding herself. And so a lot of her ego has been stripped away. So maybe in that way she becomes a better person. But I think it's almost after the story. I see her as sort of being taught a lesson for being such a jerk, actually. But I still feel empathy with her, which is really, I think, what the story is meant to make you feel. But because I wrote a character who dislikes her so much, I've spent so much time through his eyes that I'm like, ugh, this woman.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that's how I think about it. But that's where the short story comes in. But it's a really beautiful short story. And Guy de Maupassant was sort of one of the things that happens in the book is that Victor, the sad sack from the beginning, who I'll spoil a tiny bit of it for you, in addition to his sort of general misanthropic behavior at the wedding, he also has just lost his job at the internet's 6th largest search engine, which was not a company that was doing that well anyway. And he has a slight alcohol problem, and his apartment gets broken into, and he just says this sort of everything bad happened to him, and he becomes obsessed with Guy de Maupassant because he sees him as this sort of like French Hemingway, this like literary hero. And it's true, like the more I read about him in researching this book, it's fascinating. He dropped out of military school, and his mother was like, you're aimless, I'm going to contact my friend who was on the adjoining farm. They grew up in the north of France. My friend from the neighboring farm, and he's going to take care of you, and you're going to live with him for a while. And that friend turned out to be Flaubert, which I'm like, that's convenient, but that's never happened to me. And he also would do things like women would just send him flowers because he was just such a lady killer. He died of syphilis, so there's also that dark side. But they would send him flowers. At one point, a woman sent him roses and said you were missed in Paris because he was out of town. And he sent them back dressed up as women, stuffed with cotton balls in their bellies, saying all in one night. He's really quite a character. But anyway, That's enough about ghee. Any questions? Hi.
Hi. You mentioned that mentioned that you guys worked in publishing
Mm.
together. Do you think that influenced your writing in any way?
I tried not to let it. I mean, it influenced it in a good way mostly. I mean, what happened was Ethan and I worked. My first job was for a literary agent, which I quit just before I was going to get fired anyway. I hope none of you have this experience. And then I thought maybe, okay, editorial for me, especially, English major, creative writing major, lover of books. But then all my internships were in magazines, and I kind of missed the social aspect of it. So I thought in between was book publicity, where you're sort of this sort of Lorax for books. You're the one speaking for them and getting them out. And so because I wasn't actually editing books, I think it was less sort of infiltrating to my own writing. And because what I was exposed to was also had gone through the gauntlet, right? Somebody had, been in their little room and written this thing and then sent it to an agent. So it went through that gauntlet. Somebody obviously, agreed to represent them. And then an editor at a publishing house agreed to publish it. And then, so forth and so forth. So that by the time I saw them, I thought, well, every book that gets written is very good. Not quite, but so in that way it was sort of inspiring in that, where you think, okay, I can do this. Because I grew up in a house that was full of smart people, but not an intensely literary house. Like we definitely had more like yellow spines of National Geographics in my vision than actual books. And so for me, it was sort of this almost like quiet little green light that said, yes, this is a career. You can do this. And part of that is just seeing authors behave like crazy people. And just, most of them are lovely, but seeing that they're human as well is helpful. But then sometimes the actual writing, I felt weird, especially in the nonfiction, about writing about my job, because it felt like what I actually did. So it's actually almost noticeably absent, except for one essay from both of the nonfiction books that I worked in book publishing. But that's okay, because reading about work is only so interesting anyway, so it's okay. Anyway, that's also a long answer. If we want to go rapid fire, they won't all be this long. Hi.
How do you take like a really small moment, like the Oregon Trail or something, and then make it into something bigger? Because we can read it and kind of piece everything together and see the meaning, but how do you get it to that point?
It depends. They all start sort of differently. I mean, I think that usually they start not with the story and not with the anecdote, but with some sort of larger theme I'm interested in, and then you sort of drill down from there and see if you have any bullet points in your memory of, a specific thing. But then something with Oregon Trail, it's shorter. That essay is really short. And so you can sort of take that thought to fruition. I would not for the life of me be able to write a 10,000 word essay on Oregon Trail. I just don't know what I would say. I don't think it has that much meaning, but it really is sort of a snapshot of a time period and an age. And so that's one thing to think about too, is you sort of think about just what else it's tied to. Like if you just pull that thread in the sweater and see if the whole sweater goes, but in a good way, because that sounds like you'd ruin your sweater, but in a good way. But I don't fully know the answer to how to pick these things. But you find out pretty quickly if you're going in the wrong direction. I would say, I have a lot of 2-paragraph, half-done essays that will never see the light of day, because I'm like, this is just me, it's stand-up. It doesn't have any depth to it. It doesn't have a second layer to it. It doesn't seem applicable to someone larger than myself. It's not, or it feels like a diary entry, which is not good. So it's more, I can almost answer your question in terms of when I know it's not working. I wrote an essay once that I remember I submitted to the Village Voice when I was writing them, and they rejected it on site, which they should have. And it was about, I was annoyed because I had been pulled over for a speeding ticket. And it was about my interaction with the cop. No one cares. Because there's a way to do that essay. Maybe now there's a way to write it, however, so someone could care. Maybe there's a way to write it because it's the first time you've ever gotten in trouble and what that feels like, about where you were going, about your interaction with someone, or maybe if it was funny, or maybe if the cop had lost my license in the crack of his car, you know, if there was something else aside from boohoo, you know, to latch onto. But yeah, that's the answer.
In writing this novel, did you reach any points of stagnation, or did you find that it kind of wrote itself? And if you did reach a block, like, how did you overcome that?
What was this like? Did I any points of stagnation, or did it ever what itself?
Like, write itself.
Okay. I was like, it never wrote itself, which is annoying. But I did, yeah, there were points where because you eventually it becomes this sort of thing that you've built that you're responsible for, like this like giant, like, you know, Jenga, you know, and then suddenly if you start messing with it, or you know, you could potentially hurt something else where you think, okay, so you sort of write yourself into a corner a little bit, which is the case for planning, but even the best planning and some of it, which I did, just, you know, there's certain weaknesses that I know that are in the book. Like all 3 of them had to get to France. But how do you get 3 people separately at the same time to France and have it be plausible? You know, for Victor, it's the easiest. He's gone in search of this missing necklace, and he's become obsessed with this French writer. I mean, he's got more than enough reasons. For Kezia, she works for a jewelry company, and what's gone wrong with the necklace can only be fixed by a manufacturer in France, which is true. I talked to jewelry designer friends about it. Also, it's the clasp that's faulty, obviously, just to really hit that nail on the head. And then Nathaniel really looks around his sort of like superficial, sort of inside baseball LA life and just wants out. And so, like, I struggled with giving him enough motivation at the same time period that the other 2 have. Like, why does he go? I think it works well enough, but it's one of these things where I'm like, oh, but if I change that, I have to change these other things. So it's not that I was stagnant, it's that I had to figure out how to get out of the maze in a new way, but I always wanted to. But I didn't, you know, I wrote almost every day, but not every single day. Yeah.
Comedy seems like a big part of your work, and I was wondering if that kind of comes out initially or in the revision process, like, do you have to add it afterwards?
I just like the idea of just like making the phone book really funny, just like typing it in. It depends on who's talking for the fiction. That would be really scary if that was my answer for the nonfiction. But basically, you kind of have to rein it in a little bit because there's that likability thing that I think people go for both in fiction and nonfiction that can be really damaging. Like what can possibly be rewarded in real life can be damaging a little bit on the page, where if you're just constantly this dancing monkey and entertaining people, it's just all jokes, no heart, and it just looks like you're trying so hard. So really you have to like weed it out a little bit and think, what's the point? What am I trying to say? And let things rest a little bit more. It's there's a Coco Chanel quote, which is random, but where she said you should always get dressed and then take one thing off, and it's sort of applicable to, I think, comedy, especially in narrative nonfiction, where you go so far and you're like, if you go back one step and have a little faith in your reader and like for instance, maybe I shouldn't have had the actual clasp be what's broken on the necklace. Just having the necklace broken would have been sufficient. I don't think so, but that's a good example. But yeah, if anything, I just sort of wind it back a little, which isn't to say that it's like also uproariously funny. It's just that, you know, I'm going to keep doing this gesture. Hi.
I think I heard it mentioned earlier that this is going to be a movie. Are you part of that at all?
I am. So Universal has optioned it for a movie, which is exciting, but I don't know how much everyone knows about options, but it basically means that like we're gonna let you like, it's like being in kindergarten and planning where you're gonna go to college. So like I don't know like what's gonna happen with it. You know, we'll see. Let's see. But I'm gonna write it. So yes, so that'll be exciting. And yeah, I actually think I have to start writing it next week. So anyone has any tips or tricks, you're welcome to offer them.
I think we have time for maybe one more
One more
question.
question?
Or no more
Or
questions.
no more question? Oh, one more question.
So I'm like in the middle of writing a thesis. Well, I guess I'm in the start of writing my thesis right now. And
And like, I'm finding it like hard to self-motivate. Do you have any advice?
Well, I mean, you said self with such emphasis. I'm curious, what outside motivation do you like hire someone to yell at you? What is your thesis on?
It's a poetry thesis.
Oh man,
Yeah.
wow! My hat's off to you. I'm such a bad poet. I mean, one thing I do, and this is so simple, but it just whenever I get stuck, I think how lucky I am to have this job and to be able to do this, and that anyone wants to read it. And I think the words literally like a CNN crawl across my brain are like, go play with your toy. Go play with your toy. And, you know, you make it fun and like literally the same thing you would do. I mean, you sort of treat yourself like a 5-year-old, which I don't know if this is the best advice, but it works for me. You know, where you're like, oh, this like fun learning game, or we're going to play a fun game called Eat Your Dinner. You know? And I feel like similarly that's how I think of it. And I feel like now you also have the added bonus of, you know, no rent and free food. So just like really enjoy it. And probably a lot of like free beer too. I don't know what's happening. But but either way, you know, I think you just sort of enjoy this time period and the time you have to think about it. And the other thing is, in a more sort of practical way, leave your dorm room. Just if it's like you're struggling with it or whatever it is, leave campus. Go somewhere else. I don't care if you go to a mini mart. I don't care what it is. And don't even go with the pressure of, oh, I'm going for inspiration. Just leave and go somewhere for an hour and come back. And I think that is the best thing you can do. Time.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. It was great.